Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're finally tackling something a lot of you have been asking about, Turkey's foreign policy, and specifically under President Erdogan.
Yeah.
We've got a ton of research on this from the Turkish Democracy Project. It's a really fascinating but also kind of a complicated situation. I've been learning a lot just getting ready for this. What I'm really curious about is what you find most surprising as we go through all of this. We'll be talking about Turkey's actions, Syria, Iraq, even Libya and Cyprus, and trying to make sense of, I guess you could call this new assertiveness.
Yeah, it's a real shift. I mean, Turkey used to be all about zero problems with neighbors.
Yeah.
They wanted to be everyone's friend.
Mm-hmm.
But under Erdogan, things have really changed. What we're seeing now, there are these historical echoes. It's almost like Erdogan is trying to revive the Ottoman Empire, and make Turkey like the dominant force in the region again.
Yeah, that Ottoman Empire comparison, it's not just talk, is it? There seems to be like a real strategy behind all this. So Turkey wants to be powerful again, but why? What's the end game?
Well, there are a few things going on. There's definitely an element of nationalism, appealing to this idea of Turkey as this historic power.
Right.
But it's also about practical things, like securing energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Right.
Projecting influence in areas that were once part of the Ottoman sphere.
Okay, so resources, influence, and it seems like the Kurdish question plays a big role in all of this, too.
Absolutely. The Turkish Democracy Project research really shows how important the suppression of Kurdish aspirations is behind a lot of Turkey's foreign interventions.
Yeah.
We see this most clearly in what they're doing in Syria and Iraq.
Right, Syria. Turkey's basically created their own little zone of control in the north. And it seems like they're really targeting areas with a strong Kurdish presence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the Syrian Democratic Forces come in, the SDF. They were really important in the fight against ISIS, a major ally to the U.S. and other Western countries.
Mm-hmm.
But Turkey sees them as a threat because of their links to the PKK.
Right.
Which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. So you have this crazy situation where Turkey's essentially attacking a group that was crucial in defeating ISIS. And all because of their own internal security concerns.
Yeah, it just seems so counterproductive. And it's the civilians who are caught in the middle, which is just tragic. The Turkish Democracy Project report mentions hundreds of thousands of people being displaced, including minorities like Yazidis and Christians. It's devastating.
Absolutely. It's awful. The report quotes the SDF leader, Mazlum Kobani.
Okay.
And he sums it up perfectly. He says, "The Turkish invasion caused tremendous harm to our people. Our people suffered mass displacement. They were subjected to demographic engineering and ethnic cleansing. Those Kurds can no longer return to their homes."
It's just awful. And then you have Iraq, where Turkey's also become way more aggressive. I mean, they were a big economic partner to the Kurdish regional government.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're launching airstrikes against suspected PKK targets.
Right.
Setting up illegal military bases, like a complete 180.
Yeah, it's a total disregard for Iraqi sovereignty.
Yeah.
There's even this one statement from the Turkish interior minister. It almost sounds like they want to control parts of northern Iraq. It's wild.
So there's a pattern here, right? Syria, Iraq, Turkey's putting their own security concerns first, even if it means alienating allies and causing instability in the region.
Yeah. And you see that same desire for regional control on what they're doing in Libya. They've taken advantage of the civil war there to push their own interests.
Libya, that seems like a whole other thing. What are they doing there?
They've decided to back the Government of National Accord, the GNA, which is one of the groups fighting for control. They send them weapons, drones, even Syrian mercenaries.
Wait, Syrian mercenaries? So they're bringing the Syrian conflict into another country?
Yeah, it's caused a lot of controversy, especially since there's a UN arms embargo on Libya.
Right.
But Turkey's ignoring that, going all in on the GNA.
Okay, I have to ask. Why get so involved in a conflict that, on the surface, seems pretty far from Turkey's interests?
There are a few reasons. First, economics. Libya has a lot of oil and gas reserves. Turkey wants a piece of that. Second, power in the Eastern Mediterranean. By supporting the GNA, they can potentially use Libyan ports and build up their navy in the region. And lastly, they want to challenge their rivals like Egypt and the UAE, who are backing the other side in Libya.
So it's like this big chess game. Turkey's trying to outsmart its opponents and expand its influence everywhere.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting spot, Cyprus.
Cyprus, long history there. The island's been divided since '74 after a Turkish invasion.
Yeah, and under Erdogan, we've seen a real push to assert Turkish control over the north, allegations of meddling in elections, and Erdogan's been pushing for a two-state solution, which would basically make the division of Cyprus permanent and really solidify Turkey's presence there.
So we see the same pattern. Syria, Iraq, Libya, Cyprus, Turkey, taking bold actions to expand their influence and achieve their goals. But what I still don't get is, how does this work with them being in NATO? They're supposed to be allies with countries like Greece,
Right.
and yet we see all this tension between them.
It's a good point, and this is where things get really tense in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Turkey challenging Greece's maritime borders. They're using this concept called Mavi Vatan, or blue homeland.
Okay, Mavi Vatan, haven't heard that one before. What's that all about?
Well, Mavi Vatan basically expands Turkey's maritime claims in the Eastern Mediterranean, taking in areas that Greece considers their own waters. It's a very specific, some might say controversial interpretation of international law, and it's led to Turkey doing some pretty provocative things.
Like what? What have they been doing?
For example, they signed this maritime border agreement with the GNA in Libya that completely ignores several Greek islands.
Really?
Yeah, and they've sent warships into disputed waters. And then there's Erdogan's rhetoric. He's made some strong statements challenging Greek sovereignty.
Wow, so things are getting pretty heated between them. And all of this is happening within NATO, which is supposed to be military alliance.
Right.
How do you even square that? It seems really risky.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation. And it raises a lot of questions about the future of NATO and the stability of the whole region. But before we get into that, I'm curious, what are your initial thoughts on all this? What's standing out to you as particularly interesting or concerning?
I mean, honestly, this whole Mavi Vatan concept, it's pretty wild. It's like Turkey's redrawing the map in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they're willing to go head-to-head with Greece to do it. That's a NATO ally.
Yeah.
You know, it's a bold move.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think it shows that Turkey, under Erdogan, they're not satisfied with just being a passive player in the region anymore. They want to be calling the shots, being a major power, and they're willing to use force to get there.
But doesn't that risk backfiring? You know, they're pushing things so far, making enemies, causing tensions. Could this end up isolating Turkey in the long run?
Yeah, it's definitely a risk. And some people think Turkey's walking a tightrope here, They could be overreaching, and that might hurt them in the long term. But there's another way to look at it.
Okay, I'm listening.
Some people argue that Erdogan is actually a very smart strategist. They say he's playing the long game.
Okay.
He's taking advantage of this multipolar world where the old alliances are changing and countries like Turkey have more room to maneuver.
So instead of just siding with the West like they did during the Cold War, they're playing all sides,
Right.
making deals with Russia, China, whoever helps them at the moment.
Exactly. It's about getting as much leverage as possible, not being tied down to any one bloc. And it seems to be working, at least with some of the Turkish people.
You mean there's a sense of national pride seeing Turkey asserting itself on the world stage?
Exactly. There's this feeling that Turkey's finally standing up for itself, taking back its place as a regional power.
But isn't that nationalism a bit of a double-edged sword? I mean, we've seen how that kind of thinking can be used to justify aggression, to silence critics.
That's a great point, and it's one of the things the Turkish Democracy Project is worried about. They point to the erosion of democratic institutions in Turkey. The crackdown on free speech, journalists and political opponents being jailed. They're saying this trend toward authoritarianism is connected to Turkey's more assertive foreign policy.
So the tighter Erdogan's grip on power at home, the more he feels he can act aggressively abroad.
That's the idea. And it's a worrying trend, not just for Turkey, but for the whole region. Because if Turkey becomes more authoritarian, more nationalistic, it's probably going to be even more unpredictable and confrontational in its foreign policy.
That's a bit scary. And it makes this whole situation even more complicated because we can't just look at Turkey's actions on their own, right? We have to think about the domestic political situation, the regional power dynamics, the changes happening globally. It's like a giant puzzle with all these interconnected pieces.
It is. And that's why it's so important to think about this in a nuanced way, to avoid oversimplifying or jumping to conclusions. We need to understand the complexity, consider the different viewpoints, and really think about the potential consequences of what Turkey's doing.
You know, one thing that keeps coming back to me is the human cost of all of this.
Yeah.
We talked about displaced civilians in Syria, the disregard for Iraq's sovereignty, the mercenaries in Libya. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitics, but we can't forget that real people are being affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. That's something we should always remember. Foreign policy isn't just about abstract ideas or power struggles. It has real-world consequences for people's lives, their safety, their future.
It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and watch this happen. We have to stay informed, talk about these issues, and hold our leaders accountable.
I agree, and that's what I think is so valuable about this deep dive. It's given us a chance to really unpack this complicated issue, to explore different perspectives, and to think critically about the challenges ahead.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening, that's for sure. And I've got a lot of questions I'm still trying to figure out. But before we wrap up this part, what would you say are the key takeaways from all this? What should we be watching for as this story develops?
I think the main takeaway is that Turkey, under Erdogan, is determined to be a major player in the region. And they're not afraid to upset people or challenge the status quo to get there.
Right, so we can expect more of this assertive, maybe even aggressive behavior from Turkey.
I think so, but the question is what will happen as a result? Will this approach ultimately make Turkey stronger, or will it lead to more instability and isolation?
And what about NATO? Can the alliance really function if one member is actively challenging another?
Those are tough questions, and I don't think anyone has the answers right now. But they're questions we need to be asking, because a lot is at stake. What happens in Turkey affects the whole region, Europe, even the global balance of power.
It's a lot to process, but I feel like we've made some progress in understanding this complex issue. I'm sure you, as our listener, have your own thoughts and questions right now. So before we move on to the last part of this deep dive, we want to hear what's standing out to you.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this turning point, doesn't it? Turkey's making these big moves, shaking things up. But where does it all go? Are they becoming this new regional power, or are they headed for trouble?
Yeah, it's the big question, right? And honestly, I don't know what the future holds, but I think what's really interesting is that Turkey is forcing us to think bigger.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, for a long time, we just assumed countries like Turkey would side with the West,
Yeah.
follow the rules. But Erdogan's saying, no, we're doing our own thing. It's a challenge to the way things are, the existing power structures, and that could really change the whole geopolitical landscape. So it's not just about Turkey's ambitions, it's about what this means for global alliances, how power is shared in the 21st century.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand everything that's going on here. Turkey's domestic politics, their economy, their history, their regional rivalries. It
Mm.
all feeds into this assertive foreign policy.
And we can't forget about the Turkish people. They're the ones who will feel the effects of these policies, good or bad.
You're right. We can't just focus on the geopolitical maneuvering. We have to think about the human impact. What does this mean for everyday Turkish citizens? What are they hoping for? What are they afraid of? How will their lives change because of these decisions?
It's a good reminder that foreign policy isn't just some game. It has a real impact on people's lives, on their sense of safety, on how well they can live.
And that's what makes this whole thing so interesting, I think. It's not just about power politics. It's about people, about what they want, about their struggles.
It's about choices too, isn't it? The choices leaders make, the choices everyday people make, and how those choices can affect everything, change the course of history.
Exactly. And that leads to a big question for you, the listener. Thinking about everything we've talked about, what should the rest of the world do about all of this? What role should the international community play?
That's a big one. It's clear that what Turkey's doing is affecting the region and beyond. But what can the rest of the world do? Should they even do anything?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. No easy answers. But here are a few things to think about. Should they try to stop Turkey, to push back against these actions, or should they try to work with Turkey to find ways to cooperate?
And how do you balance all of that? I mean, Turkey's an important part of NATO, but they're also doing things that are destabilizing and worrying. It's tough.
It is, and I think it needs a careful approach, one that understands the problems but also the possibilities. We need to be honest about what Turkey's doing, but also be open to talking and cooperating when we can.
It's about finding that middle ground, right? Between standing up for what we believe in and finding ways to work together.
Exactly. And that takes really understanding the issues, listening to different viewpoints, and trying to find solutions that work for everyone.
This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. We've covered so much, from the Kurdish question to Mavi Vatan, from tensions in NATO to what all this means for global power.
And I hope it's helped you listening to understand more about Turkey's role in the world, which is complicated and always changing.
We'll definitely be hearing more about Turkey and Erdogan. But for now, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey. We've talked about a lot, but the most important thing to remember is this. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and never stop learning.
I agree. The world's full of tough challenges. But if we keep trying to learn and understand, we can face them together.
Thanks for listening.